Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going on a journey.
Ooh, I like journeys.
Yeah, this one is into the world of mental imagery.
I love that topic.
Me too. And we've got Bence Nanay's book here, Mental Imagery, Philosophy, Psychology, Neuroscience. We're going to extract the coolest stuff out of it.
Yeah, his book really helps us see that that mental imagery is way more than just daydreaming. It's like connected to our perceptions.
Yeah.
To our emotions, even to our actions.
Right. To kick things off, let's just jump right into Nanay's definition of mental imagery. He says, perceptual representation not directly triggered by sensory input. Can you break down what perceptual representation means?
Yeah, so like imagine you're closing your eyes and you picture an apple.
Okay.
Like a bright red apple. You're not actually seeing it with your eyes, right?
Right.
But your brain is creating that experience. That's similar to like real perception. So that's what perceptual representation is. It's your brain like generating a mental experience that's like mirrors what it would be like to actually see something.
Yeah. So it's like our brains are making their own little VR shows.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just vision, it's all of our senses.
So I could have a mental image of the smell of cookies.
Yeah, absolutely. Or the sound of waves at the beach. Or the taste of chocolate.
Oh, yeah.
Even the feeling of sand between your toes.
Right. All mental imagery.
All mental imagery.
Now, here's where it gets really crazy. Mental imagery can even happen without us knowing.
So consciously?
Yeah, unconsciously.
Yeah.
He talks about these studies about unconscious priming, where, like, being exposed to something can, like, later on influence your responses, even if you weren't aware of it, when it happened.
Right. Like subliminal messaging for your brain?
Yeah, exactly. So there's one study where they had people either imagine a red apple or specifically avoid thinking about one, and then afterwards they show in these images, it's this illusion where your perception like flips back and forth between two images. And even the people who were trying not to think about the red apple were more likely to see red in the illusion.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, it is.
So even when we think we're in control, there's all this stuff happening under the surface.
All the time.
Yeah. And, it makes you think, what else is happening that we don't know about?
Right.
That our unconscious is, like, shaping.
Right.
Yeah. Before we go any further, I want to talk about a modal completion.
Okay.
Because I think it really, like, shows how powerful mental imagery is.
Yeah. A modal completion is just our brain's ability to fill in missing information. To create a whole picture.
Right.
So if you see a cat hiding behind a picket fence, you only see parts of the cat.
Right.
But your brain automatically fills in the gaps, so you see a complete cat.
So my brain is basically drawing in the rest of the cat.
Exactly.
Based on what it can see.
Based on what it can see. And Nanay argues that that's actually a form of mental imagery.
Oh, wow.
So your brain is creating a representation of the missing parts of the cat, and that allows you to see it as a whole.
So what we normally think of as just seeing is actually our eyes and then our brains, like, filling in all this stuff.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It is. Yeah. It really challenges this idea that that perception is just a passive process of taking in information.
Right.
Instead, it seems like our brains are actively constructing our experience of the world using mental imagery to like fill in the gaps and make sense of what we're seeing.
Yeah. And then it's even more interesting because that filling in the gaps can be influenced by our beliefs and expectations.
Right. Yeah.
So if you think a house is haunted, you're more likely to interpret a creaking sound or a shadow as something spooky.
Right.
Even though it's probably just the wind.
Right.
Or the house is just old.
Yeah. So our preconceived notions can literally change how we see the world.
It's like we're all walking around with our own little filter bubbles.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so important to be aware of our own biases.
Yeah.
Because they can have a big impact on how we see and interpret the world.
Yeah. Now it gets even more mind-boggling.
Yeah.
When we start talking about multimodal mental imagery, where our different senses, like, interact with each other.
Yeah.
In our image.
Yeah.
In our mental image.
Yeah, so like one of the coolest examples of this is if you watch a video of somebody talking, but you turn the sound off, often we'll hear their voice in our heads.
Yes.
Even though there's no sound.
It happens to me all the time.
Our visual system triggers auditory mental imagery.
Wow.
And we fill in the missing sound based on what we know about how people talk.
It's like our brains are always trying to create this complete sensory experience.
Right, exactly. And this actually connects to a classic philosophical puzzle, the Molyneux problem.
Okay, I've heard of that. But remind me.
Yeah, so it asks whether a person who's born blind but learns to identify shapes by touch, if they were to suddenly regain their sight, could they visually recognize those
Oh,
shapes?
right.
So, like, what comes first?
Yeah.
Touch or vision?
And what does he say about that?
Monet. So he points to research on people who've actually had their sight restored after being blind, and some people they lacked visual imagery before they regained their sight, and then they
Mhm.
couldn't actually identify shapes visually, even though their eyes were working.
So it's not enough to just have like working eyes.
Right.
You need that like ability to create the images in your mind.
Exactly. You need the mental capacity to actually create those visual representations in your mind. And this shows how closely connected mental imagery is to how we see the world. You
Yeah.
know, it's like mental imagery is the bridge between our senses and our understanding of reality.
And it's not just perception either. It turns out that mental imagery is super connected to how we understand and use language.
It's true.
How so?
Yeah, so like think about how you understand a description. Like if somebody tells you about a beautiful sunset, you don't just process the words, you automatically create a mental image, right? Of a sky and colors and maybe even the feeling of warmth.
Yeah, that's so true. We're not just like understanding the words, we're creating whole experiences in our minds.
Yeah, and usually what we remember is actually the image, not the words.
Yeah, that's true. It makes sense.
It's like our brains prefer to store information in the form of these like multi-sensory experiences.
Hmm. Yeah, and this is also evident in the Stroop effect.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried to say the color of a word when the word itself is a different color?
Oh yeah, it's surprisingly difficult.
Yeah. The word red is written in blue ink.
Right.
And Nanny says that this is because when you read the word, you automatically get a mental image of the wrong color,
Uh-huh.
which then like messes with your ability to say the ink color.
Right. It interferes with your ability to correctly perceive and name the ink color.
I'm gonna have to try that later.
Yeah.
That's wild. So our brains are doing all this stuff all the time,
All the time.
even without us knowing.
Yeah, even without us knowing.
It's amazing. And this is like the tip of the iceberg. We're just getting started.
Just getting started.
There's so much more to explore when it comes to mental imagery.
Absolutely. In the next part, we'll delve into how mental imagery plays a role in our desires, our actions, and even in clinical settings. So stick around.
Welcome back, deep divers. We're going to keep exploring mental imagery. And this time, we're going to see how it influences our actions. It's pretty wild how we can use mental imagery to plan and actually carry out actions even when we're not like interacting with the real object.
Yeah, it's like having a VR simulator in our minds. Like think about pretending to sip from an imaginary glass of water.
Okay.
You're not just like holding your hand up in the air randomly. You're moving your hand like you're actually holding a glass.
Right, it's like my brain is choreographing the whole thing, like how my fingers would wrap around the glass, the angle of my wrist. It's really detailed.
Yeah, and this mental rehearsal, it's super important for learning new skills and getting better at things. Like athletes will often visualize their movements before a competition, and musicians will mentally rehearse a difficult piece of music before they play it.
So they're using mental imagery to like practice and like work out the kinks before they even have to do the real thing.
Yeah, it's like giving your brain a sneak peek at the task at hand.
That's cool. Now, we talked a little bit about using mental imagery in therapy, but I want to hear more about that.
Yeah, so it's a really exciting field that's growing a lot. So like techniques like imaginal exposure, they're being used to help patients who have phobias or PTSD or other conditions. It helps them to confront their fears, but in a safe and controlled way.
So instead of actually being exposed to like a spider, if they're afraid of spiders, they just imagine it really vividly and they can work through it.
Exactly. Yeah. So they're not actually having to face the real thing, but they're imagining the scenario and they're using techniques to manage their anxiety while they're doing it.
Yeah.
So it's like a dress rehearsal for facing their fears in real life. And over time, that can help them to reduce the intensity of their fear.
It's amazing. Like we can use our imagination to literally change how our brains respond to stuff in real life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like hacking into your mental operating system and rewriting the code for how you react to certain things.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And so this isn't just for like phobias and PTSD. They use it for other things too, right?
Yeah. So it's also being used to treat addiction and eating disorders and even chronic pain. For example, some people with chronic pain, they use visualization techniques to manage their pain. They might imagine themselves in a peaceful setting, or imagine that they have control over their pain.
Hmm. It's like our mental focus can have a real impact on our bodies.
Yeah, exactly. And it really highlights how connected our minds and bodies really are.
Yeah. So we've been talking about how mental imagery shapes the way we see the world and our actions and our emotions. But Nanay says it also affects how we understand abstract things too.
Yeah, so he explores this idea that maybe our ability to reason abstractly is actually based to our ability to simulate things mentally. So instead of like manipulating abstract symbols, we might be creating mental models. We might be using imagery to visualize things and see how they might play out.
So if I'm trying to solve a problem, I might mentally play out different scenarios, like what would happen if I do this or what would happen if I do that.
Yeah, exactly. Like your brain is running these mental experiments using imagery to test out different hypotheses and find the best solution.
Yeah, it's like how I try to figure out how to fit furniture through a door. I have to mentally rotate it to see if it'll fit.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great example. You're using mental imagery to create a spatial simulation so you can
Mhm.
see if it'll work.
Yeah, so even when we're thinking about abstract things, it still seems like we're using mental images.
Yeah, yeah, it's like we're turning abstract concepts into something more concrete that we can actually work with.
Hmm, I like that. So what about these object files?
Oh yeah, object files, they're like temporary mental representations that keep track of objects over time. So
Mhm.
think of it like a mental dossier for the things that we encounter in
Yeah.
the world. They help us to keep track of things,
Okay.
to recognize things even when they're partially hidden or moving around, and to understand how they interact.
So it's like each object has its own little folder in my brain that's always updating?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great way to think about it.
Okay.
And Nanay explores this idea of whether those object files might be made up of mental images. So instead of just storing a bunch of facts about an object, maybe our brains are creating and updating a mental picture of it.
So instead of just remembering facts about my coffee cup, I'm actually storing a picture of it.
Exactly, yeah. And that helps to explain why our memories are often so visual and emotionally charged. We're not just remembering facts, we're reliving those experiences through the images that are stored in our object files.
Hmm. That's a cool way to think about memory. And does that mean that our mental imagery can affect our memory?
Yeah, yeah. So mental imagery, it can both enhance and distort our memories.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So it can make it easier to remember things.
Exactly. So creating vivid mental images can make things more memorable and easier to recall. Like that's why those mnemonic techniques often involve creating those crazy mental pictures. Like if
Hmm.
you want to remember to buy bread at the store, you might imagine a giant loaf of bread.
Right, right. But so how does it distort memory?
Yeah, so on the other hand, mental imagery can also lead to false memories. Have you ever imagined something so vividly that you started to believe that it actually
Oh,
happened?
yeah, we've all done that. Where it's like, I don't know if that was a dream or if it really happened.
Exactly. Our brains, they can sometimes have trouble distinguishing between real memories and imagined events,
Hmm.
especially if those images are emotionally charged or we've thought about them a lot.
So our imagination can really mess with our memory.
Yeah, so it's important to keep in mind that our memories aren't always perfect recordings of the past. They can be influenced by our emotions, our imaginations, and even our desires.
Hmm. Okay, so what about different types of imagination? How does that work?
Yeah, so Nune, he goes into the difference between sensory imagination and propositional imagination. So sensory imagination is where we create those mental images of sights and sounds and other sensory experiences. And propositional imagination is where we're imagining abstract things like concepts or possibilities.
So like sensory imagination is picturing a beach,
Uh-huh.
and then propositional is more like imagining I could fly.
Right, exactly. And so sensory imagination, it definitely involves mental imagery,
Hmm.
but the role of imagery in propositional imagination, it's a little bit more debated.
So can you even imagine something abstract without using any sensory imagery?
Hmm.
Because I feel like my mind always goes to pictures and experiences.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Nene looks at different perspectives on that. So some philosophers say that that all types of imagination, they ultimately rely on mental imagery, even when we're imagining abstract things. They might say that even if we're not consciously aware of it, that we're still creating some kind of mental representation.
Right. Like even abstract ideas need something to hold on to.
Right, right. And then others argue that propositional imagination can happen without any sensory content. So it's an interesting debate. And it really gets at the core of how we understand imagination.
Yeah, it's like, what's going on in our brains when we're using our imagination? Is it all pictures, or is there something else happening?
Yeah. It's a mystery that both philosophers and scientists are still trying to figure out.
Yeah. So I want to switch gears for a second and talk about how our emotions affect mental imagery. Because it seems like they would, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Our emotions, they play a huge role in shaping our mental imagery. Nanay, he talks about this thing called mood congruency.
Okay.
It's where our current emotional state can make us more likely to generate images that are consistent with that mood.
So if I'm happy, I'm more likely to think about happy things.
Right, exactly. So if you're feeling happy, you're more likely to conjure up these positive and uplifting images. And if you're feeling sad or anxious, you might dwell on more negative or worrisome images.
It's like our emotions are filtering our imagination.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like our emotions act as a filter for our imaginations. And they shape the content of our mental landscapes. And this makes me think about how people will use visualization techniques to like try to improve their mood. Like if you can choose to focus on happy images, maybe that can actually change how you feel.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's actually evidence for that.
That's cool.
Yeah. So practices like mindfulness and meditation, they often encourage people to focus on these positive or calming images to cultivate a sense of peace and well-being.
It's like a little mental vacation.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like giving your mind a mental vacation, and it can actually be really helpful for reducing stress and improving your overall mood.
So our mental imagery can be influenced by our emotions, but can mental imagery itself like have an emotional charge?
Yeah, that's a really cool question. So traditionally, we think of emotions as coming from our interpretations of events and situations, but Nanay, he raises this idea that maybe mental imagery itself can carry emotional weight, like separate from how we interpret it.
Okay, so like just seeing a picture of a smiling face would make me feel happy.
Right. Yeah. So like the mental image of a smiling face might trigger these feelings of happiness even before you even realize that it's a face or think about what it means.
Wow, it's like the image itself is making me feel something.
Yeah, exactly. And this suggests a more direct connection between our mental imagery and our emotions.
That's wild. So these mental pictures, they can actually make us feel things.
Yeah, it's incredible to think about how these mental images that we create, they can have such a strong and direct impact on how we feel.
It shows how closely connected our minds and emotions are.
It really does.
We've covered so much about mental imagery and how it affects our thinking and feeling and actions.
And we're not done yet.
Yeah, there's more.
Yeah, in the last part, we're going to look at even more interesting stuff.
Okay.
Like how mental imagery is connected to our desires and how we can use it to deal with things like implicit bias.
Okay, so stick around, deep divers. We'll be right back to finish up our journey into the world of mental imagery. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're in the home stretch now. We're going to wrap up our exploration of mental imagery with maybe the most interesting part. Like, how does mental imagery help us understand our desires?
Yeah, Nanay, he says that mental imagery is like really important for how we imagine what we want, like the end goal of what we're aiming for.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, like, let's say my dream is to travel the world. Is he saying that I have, like, a mental picture of myself at the Eiffel Tower or something?
Well, maybe not that specifically, but yeah. It's like your desire isn't just this vague feeling, you know? It's actually connected to a mental picture of like what it would be like to actually do it, like a snapshot of the future you want.
It's like having a vision board in my mind.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so how does that help us understand what desire is?
Well, think about how we can want things even when we know, like logically, maybe we shouldn't, like all those New Year's resolutions.
Oh, yeah. Like, I would go to the gym every day.
Right. Like we set these goals, even though we know we might not actually do it.
Right.
But the desire is still there.
Right, like, why is that?
Yeah, so NA says It's because those mental images are so powerful, you know? Like imagining yourself being super fit or speaking another language fluently, it's like so motivating that it kind of overrides all the doubts we have.
It's like my brain is giving me all these reasons to keep going, even when I know it's hard.
Yeah. And that actually connects to a really cool idea in philosophy, the direction of fit of desire.
Correction of fit.
Yeah.
Okay, what's that?
So think about the difference between a belief and a desire.
Okay.
Our beliefs, they have to match the real world, right? Like if I believe it's raining outside, my belief is only true if it's actually raining, right?
Right, it has to match reality.
Yeah, beliefs are all about like being accurate,
Yeah.
but desires are different. They're not about passively reflecting the world, they're about changing it.
So my desire to travel the world isn't based on the fact that I'm, like, at home right now.
Right.
It's about how I want to change that.
Exactly. Desires are about making the world match what we want. And Nanay says this difference is connected to mental imagery. The images that we create in our mind, they're not just neutral. They actually have this push, you know, like
Right.
a motivation to make those images real.
This is like my mental picture of me on vacation is saying, let's do it.
Right, exactly. It's not just a picture, it's a call to action.
I like that. What is pragmatic mental imagery?
Oh, yeah. So that's another interesting thing Nanny talks about. So a lot of times our actions are guided by what we see, right?
Yeah.
Like when you reach for your coffee cup, your eyes tell you where it is and how big it is and what shape it is.
Great.
And that helps you to move your hand the right way.
Yeah, makes sense.
But Nanny says that mental imagery can do the same thing. Like it can guide our actions even when we can't see something.
Really?
Yeah. So like think about a pianist playing a piece of music from memory.
Okay.
They're not just relying on their muscles, you know? They're probably imagining the keyboard and hearing the music in their head.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. And they use those mental images to guide their fingers.
It's like they're playing the whole thing in their mind first.
Exactly. Yeah. And we all do this all the time.
Yeah, like when I walk through my house at night
Uh-huh.
and I don't turn the lights on,
Right.
I know where everything is.
You're using mental imagery to navigate, just like you would use your vision during the day.
Oh, that's amazing. So can we use mental imagery to deal with, like, implicit bias?
Yeah, so that's a really important area of research right now because implicit biases, they're those unconscious thoughts and stereotypes, you know, that can affect how we act even without us knowing it.
Right, like we don't even realize we're doing it.
Right, like you might make assumptions about someone based on their race or gender.
Right, even though we would never say that out loud.
Right, and it can be really hard to overcome those biases because we're not even aware of them.
Right.
And Nanay, he suggests that maybe mental imagery is part of the problem.
Okay.
He thinks that those implicit biases could be connected to specific mental images that we have about different groups of people.
So, like, if I have a bias against a certain group, I might have a specific picture in my mind that pops up.
Yeah, exactly. And those images can affect how you act towards people, you know?
Right.
Can lead to subtle forms of discrimination. But the cool thing is, Nanay thinks that if we become aware of those images and then start to like replace them with better ones, that we can start to change those biases.
So, like, if we catch ourselves having a biased thought, we can try to picture something different.
Yeah, exactly. Like retraining your brain to think differently.
And that actually works.
Well, yeah, there's research that shows that, yeah, that it can. Like if you show people positive images of people from groups that are often stereotyped, it can actually reduce their implicit bias over time.
That's amazing. Like, we can literally use our imagination to fight prejudice.
It's pretty cool. It's a good reminder that our minds are flexible and that we can learn and grow.
Wow, this has been such an eye-opening journey. It's like I'm seeing mental imagery everywhere now.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It's in how we make decisions, how we see the world, how we interact with other people. It's everything.
It's not just daydreaming. It's a core part of how our minds work. And it shapes how we feel, how we act, and how we see the world.
Yeah. And Nanny's book, it just shows how important it is to understand mental imagery.
Yeah.
Like if we want to understand ourselves. And he leaves us with this really interesting question. He asks, if mental imagery is so important for all of this stuff, is it the key to understanding, like, the whole mind?
That's the big question.
Yeah. And it's a question that's going to keep scientists and philosophers busy for a long time.
Yeah, and it really gets to the heart of what it means to be human. Like, what is consciousness? What is thought? And mental imagery might be a big part of the answer.
It's incredible to think that these little mental pictures in our heads could be so important. So on that note, deep divers, thank you for joining us on this exploration. Until next time, keep those imaginations working and keep exploring the amazing world of your own mind.